oppressive heat wave in the West, intensifying the already critical drought.
More than half of the continental U.S. is currently experiencing drought, and nowhere is that felt more than in the West.
The cause for concern over fire season could not be greater right now.
The desperate situation is getting much worse as 2 wildfires grow out of control.
Temperatures well into the triple digits.
How many deer and elk
fishing restrictions are in place to keep
on the heels of already deadly heat.
We are now in the midst of the worst drought we have seen in modern-day California.
I'm Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs, and today I'm talking to Outdoor Life contributor and Wyoming-based reporter Christine Peterson, who's been covering the drought and its impact on big game and fish. Then we'll check in with our hunting editor about how dry conditions in the Dakotas are affecting waterfowl production and what that means for hunters this season. Christine, so we know there's a drought out west, and droughts aren't in themselves abnormal. They happen periodically. They're just one of nature's many boom and bust cycles. But we've also been hearing about drought just about every year, it seems, and that's part of the problem, right? Year after year of drought has compounded into a major problem. So can you walk us through why it's so serious, right now?
Yeah, for sure. And probably the starkest information that's pretty easy to look at for anyone who's visual on how bad the drought is comes from a map produced and updated regularly by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Basically, it shows that 90% of the West, so essentially almost all of the West, California, Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, the West, are in a drought. And in about half that region, conditions are severe or exceptional, and then it also expands to include portions of Colorado, Wyoming, and even the Dakotas. And the problem is that unlike other droughts that we've all lived through before, which, as you say, the West evolved to have droughts, this one just seems to be getting worse. There are areas that are used to no precipitation for, say, a few weeks, and now they might not have any precipitation for a couple months. Or places that have an inch of rain or a couple inches of rain now aren't seeing any, or they're seeing, a quarter of an inch instead of the 2.5 inches they might typically get in a spring. And then even worse for reservoirs and water supplies is that moisture that used to come in the form of snow that lingered on mountains, hung out on glaciers in this sort of frozen reservoir, and then trickled down over the course of the summer, giving us all this lovely water throughout the course of summer and even fall, either doesn't come at all or is coming as rain that then rushes down early in the season and dries up. And when you have rain that comes in a torrent, as we've seen in parts of the Southwest, after a long period of drought and dry land, much of it just runs off and doesn't soak into the ground and actually do all that much.
What's this prolonged drought doing to the wildlife out there, particularly big game? Yeah,
the first thing that a lot of us think about is, well, do they or don't they have something to drink? And that's actually less of an issue. It certainly can be an issue if things get bad enough. But especially for critters like mule deer, the biggest issue is a lack of food. And that makes drought really insidious. I know at least here in Wyoming, we often hear about bad winters that, knock down hundreds of deer in a herd or thousands of deer, across a region. There will be a couple years where mule deer numbers just plummet all over the place because winters were so hard. And then you see all those pictures of dead deer just everywhere across a landscape. But drought is something more akin to sort of a slow and silent killer in terms of it just sucks moisture out of grass and wildflowers and shrubs. And so either they don't grow or they grow a little and are stunted or all that, that nice green new growth that comes on the ends of shrubs. That's really nutritious and great for mule deer and elk and pronghorn and moose. And that just doesn't grow. And so while mule deer populations aren't necessarily struggling across the board in the West, they also just aren't doing well in most places. And without all the good food deer find in the spring and summer, they go into fall weaker and less able to survive harsh conditions. And sometimes it ends up okay. There are some areas where spring and summer are really dry. Biologists are very worried about it. And then winter's just not that bad. So they can find more food. There isn't quite as much snow. So they go into spring okay. And then if they get moisture, they might be all right. But if you've got drought and then a winter that's either hard or a winter that's mild and then more drought, eventually that just means no food. And no food means nothing to eat. Nothing to eat, you can't survive.
Using the mule deer example, like how resilient are mule deer to conditions like this? Are we going to see big population die-offs or like decline in numbers over time? What is happening at large?
Yeah, it's super depends on how long this lasts. And some of it's going to be regionally specific and even herd specific, that some herds will do okay and some will disappear, particularly if this goes on long enough. Mule deer are absolutely resilient. They've adapted to live in this hard western landscape, and some have adapted to migrate 150, even 200 miles to find better food. Others, stick close to winter range, so they figured out a system that works for them. And one sort of interesting aside that I have found is that does are adapted to a long life with occasional droughts. So there's a Wyoming mule deer researcher named Kevin Monteith who calls it the selfish mother hypothesis. And that basically means a female mule deer will physiologically preserve herself over her fawn. So she's not going to keel over at the expense of a little one, which is a great strategy for longer-lived animals like mule deer. And it means that they can weather some dry years simply by not producing or delivering a low-weight fawn that probably isn't going to survive or not nursing, so that she can continue on. And then if moisture comes, she can reproduce next year. It's just that if the drought lasts long enough, the lack of fawns adds up. And then worse yet, if it really gets bad, females begin to die. And that's when herd numbers really take a hit, is if the reproducing members can't make it.
Okay, so help me wrap my head around these herds. Is there an example of a particular herd that has declined or been okay during this period of drought?
Yeah, this example goes back a little ways, but there's an interesting one. So from 1985 to 1991, there was a mule deer herd in the Sierra Nevada range of California. It went from almost 6,000 animals to fewer than 1,000. And it was entirely because of drought. The precipitation was 27% of normal then. And so they just couldn't find the food that they needed to live. And those numbers came back a little bit. They're just shy of 2,000 mule deer in that herd now. But that's been the story with a number of herds across the West. And there was a big boom of mule deer that researchers just say it's just not going to happen again, that we can't expect those highs to happen again. But that is what drought and a severe drought can do. And obviously the landscape couldn't support 6,000 animals. But it, in a 6-year period, it dropped by a lot, right? 6,000 down to 1,000. So, and then it's trying to bounce back from that they really struggle with. Though on the flip side, one point that researchers have made also, fewer mouths on the landscape does mean more food to go around. And so if there is a die-off and a number of animals die, the ones that remain generally are better off. There's more food for them to eat.
Okay, so deer and elk aren't just stressed from lack of moisture and in turn lack of food. They're also dealing with habitat issues, which wildlife are facing all across the country, right? We're seeing reduced habitat, more human development, all that sort of stuff. And we're seeing wildfires, which we've heard about a lot over the last few years, just as we've heard about the drought. Can you talk about how the drought correlates to the prevalence or the intensity of the wildfires that we've been seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just that it seems like fires are more prevalent because they're in our social media feeds and because states like Montana and portions of Wyoming and all the way over to the East Coast apparently have spent months choking on wildfire smoke. They really are getting bigger and worse. Heat and drought dry up fuels like grasses, trees, and shrubs. So that's kind of an obvious one. If things dry out quicker, they are going to burn faster. And this mega drought or prolonged drought and then heat also create these massive thunderstorms. And thunderstorms are common out here, but they pummel the ground with lightning and they don't typically bring any rain with them, which then means there's all these ways for wildfires to start and nothing that's naturally helping put them out or tamp them down. Winds also become stronger, and then conditions also stay hotter and drier into the fall, which means then we don't have snow falling on these big fires in early September and helping snuff them out, and they just keep going. And then that cycle of dry earth or sucking moisture out of the air then continues to make things drier. I mean, it is so bad, in fact, that the area burned per year in the last decade in the Rocky Mountains is twice what it was on average, like for an average year, in the previous 2,000 years, which researchers have figured out by looking at records all across the Rockies. So it really is as bad as it seems.
Drought has multiple components to it.
This is Brian Schumann, a climate expert and professor of geology and geophysics at the University of Wyoming.
There can be the lack of water. It could be less snow in the winter. It could be less summer rain. But there's also a temperature side to it. The hotter it is, the easier it is to evaporate water out of the ground or out of plants. And so it tends to be actually these dry years where we had, say, not much snow in the previous winter. So there's not much soil, there's not that much water in the ground, in the soil to get into the plants to begin with. And then you add a really hot summer or warm fall. That just means you've cured these fuels. You've made them perfect to burn. And so once you get that spark, whether it's from a person or a lightning strike, it's just that much easier for these things to ignite and turn into something big.
You know, there's discussion about poor forestry practices and how that's really our issue right now. And it doesn't have anything to do with the drought or rising temperatures or climate change, and that it's just that we've mismanaged our forests. Is there any truth to that, or is the major problem really these persistent drought conditions?
That's a great question and a super controversial one. If you can gather together a whole number of experts that are equally educated and knowledgeable on this topic, and they will give you different answers. The simplest one that I've garnered from a pretty large number of folks that I've talked to over the years is that it's both. That some forests probably should have been allowed to burn decades ago. And there's an increasingly large interface of people living in forested areas, and so it's hard. You can't let fires burn through areas where folks have houses, right? And cabins and are living. And so then it just becomes controversial and really difficult really fast. The largest wildfire in Wyoming's recent history tore through a third of the snowy range in the southeast corner of our state last year. And it burned more than 175,000 acres. And much of what it burned had been dead for years. A pine beetle epidemic roared through well over a decade ago and just left skeletons in its wake. Something needed to happen at some point. But then researchers are also really quick to point out that when a fire gets started, it burns through old burns, it burns through heavily logged area, it burns through untouched wilderness. And so once a fire starts, it doesn't seem to care how that area has been managed. It's not like logged areas. I mean, if it was a massive clear cut, it could potentially stop a fire. But a lot of times, once a fire gets going, it's going.
They just burn right across all of that. There isn't necessarily that much to be done on the ground. That said, there are some safety things for sure that can be done to at least manage the barriers around towns and houses and protect places that people really care about.
So that's why most climate and fire science researchers like Brian Schumann say that the biggest reason for the epic fires right now is this mega drought that's just not letting up.
So this mega drought, what other effects are we seeing on wildlife?
I mean, you name it, and much of the wildlife are going to struggle with drought. You know, moose are having a hard time, pronghorn are having a hard time, but fish particularly the fish like the colder water fish, so trout, salmonids, are really struggling in the West. I mean, we've all seen reports of salmon belly up from hot conditions in the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of states, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, have been asking anglers to either not fish after 2 p.m, or in some areas just not fish at all. You know, so a trout's happy temperature is somewhere in the 50s. So anything much above 65, and they really start to struggle. And largely because the oxygen levels in the water lessen, the warmer water gets. So once you have temperatures consistently in the mid 70s or into the 80s, they just can't handle it and they die.
And you're talking water temperature, right? Not the
Correct,
air temperature.
Yep, water temperature. One really easy thing for anglers to do is to just carry a thermometer with you to the river. And so if, take the temperature of the water, and if it's in the 70s, you don't fish. And so that's a nice one that sort of takes some of the guesswork out of walking to a river and thinking, is it too warm? Is it not too warm? It's hot outside. Does the water feel okay? Then you can just know.
From what your sources are telling you, does it seem like anglers are complying? Did they get the restrictions? Are they pissed? What's the mood?
I actually asked that, and it does depend on the area that you're in. It does seem like, for the most part, people have tried to be pretty compliant with it. Certainly the ones that have understood it. I've heard stories of some rivers that have in Montana, they call them the hoot owl restriction. So no fishing after 2 p.m. And there's still boats lined up in a 2-hour wait to get on a popular river, just to fish that morning time. And it does sound like, for the most part, people are trying to follow the rules and trying to do their best, but it's also going to vary, right?
Yeah. Like, you fish a lot. You do a lot of fly fishing and trout fishing. How has this affected the way that you fish this summer?
I just haven't fished very much this summer, which is kind of a bummer. I think I fly fished a handful of times this summer, and largely because it's just not been worth it as hot as it's been. And there are tailwaters that are still fine. So places that come out of the bottom of reservoirs, the temperature still stays pretty consistent, and so it's safe to fish. Or really high mountain streams I've done some fishing in, but a lot of it I've just sort of stayed away from and plan on fishing in the winter when I don't have to worry about stressing anything out.
What do all the experts and the researchers that you've talked to, like, what are they attributing these extreme weather conditions to, like this mega drought? What's causing it?
Climate change, which is, it's the same forces that are causing catastrophic floods and bigger, more frequent hurricanes, more severe tornadoes in other parts of the country and the world. They're the same systems that are causing the warming and drying here.
Clearly, the future is warmer. Some years you might have, by luck, you'll have a cold year, and by bad luck, you might have some extremely warm years in the future. But in general, things are tending to get warmer. The projections are that high elevation places in Wyoming, for example, think about a place like Jackson, Wyoming. In the next few decades, a place like Jackson, which never experiences 90-degree weather now, might have 2 weeks of it. Or if we don't mitigate our carbon emissions very well, they could easily be on track to have 2 months of 90-degree weather.
So is this, given that trend, is this the new normal? Like, what's the long-term forecast for, wildfires, wildlife out west?
Wildfires, it does seem like wildfire and drought is probably to some degree the future, depending on who you ask and what climate model they're looking at and how pessimistic they are. But, if nothing changes, it does sound like this is the direction we're headed.
This increase of temperatures at high elevation just massively increases the likelihood that you dry out those plants, you dry out those fuels, and you increase the chance that even if you get some rain in the summer, but things end up being really dry just because of the heat. Then that heat also leads to a longer time in the fall before it starts snowing, creates a longer fire season with fuels that are more likely to burn. So the risk is pretty high, and that's not going to go down as we go forward in time. And the big question, of course, is eventually if you burn everything, well, there's nothing left to burn.
Right.
So maybe the fires eventually stop because of that. But if you look at it, even at the high rates, the very large fires we're experiencing now, it would still take 50, 60 years to burn everything to the point where that would really slow down the risk. So I, looking at this summer and last summer, I expect that we're going to have pretty smoky air as a regular part of summer going forward. And, unfortunately, in a lot of places, just the real catastrophic risk of big fires.
As far as a long-term forecast for wildlife, that I don't know that researchers really know for sure. And most wildlife researchers I've talked to have said wildlife will be okay in sort of a broader sense. There will be some herds that'll disappear, that can't handle it, and others are going to be fine, and some may end up being better. There may be areas that habitat improves perhaps higher up in elevations. There was a quote from the Arizona Game and Fish's wildlife science coordinator, Jim Heffelfinger, and he told me recently that there are a million things to be paying attention to. There's no overarching feeling of doom that mule deer are done. They will continue to thrive as long as we don't screw up their habitat. And I think that's also part of the key point, is that it's that habitat that most wildlife managers are concerned about.
I mean, there's been a lot of work done up in Yellowstone looking at how did the fires in the past affect like aspens, and how did that lead to impacts on things like elk. And I would say there's still been a lot of debate around what the real long-term consequences are. I mean, good thing is the animals are pretty smart and they manage these changes, but there's no doubt that the habitat that they depend on gets changed in dramatic ways.
Do they get out of the way? I mean, how many animals actually just die in fires, especially some of these really massive ones?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are large numbers of animals that get killed by fires. I mean, they don't always escape. You think about the East Troublesome Fire in northern Colorado last year. It burned almost 100,000 acres in a single day. I mean, that was moving so fast, it was virtually impossible for anything to get out of its way. So there can be direct, kill of animals. Birds can impact fish because of the way the ash gets in the streams. But animals do take shelter, like they'll get down into streams and lakes and try to, do the same thing people would naturally do to get away from the fire. But it doesn't always work.
Like you said, this is very pessimistic. It's a lot of depressing news. But there are also examples where climate change is helping certain species that are better able to adapt. Is there any silver lining to any of this?
So, yeah, I mean, part of this is that fires can be good for big game, and are. I mean, Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, for example, require open landscapes to see predators, to move around to find food. So if if those higher mountain meadows become overgrown with trees, bighorn sheep herds will dwindle. And if a fire rolls through and then grass grows after it and little plants and stuff, then they'll do better. And your local biologists have gone and looked at that burn area from the big fire in Wyoming last year. And already, so 1 year later, or 9 months later this summer, it was covered in bright pink fireweed and new aspens and other growth, which is going to be like a nutritional candy store for elk. And so biologists are actually really pretty optimistic about wildlife herds in some of these areas.
Like, even if you go all the way back to the 1988 fires up in Yellowstone, there's this patchwork where there's some areas that get burned to a crisp, and they still, decades later, are slow to recover. But a lot of the rest of the area wasn't burned as severe. And so already this year up in the Mullen Fire area, you've got things coming back in, and that new green growth is probably going to be great forage for some animals. Now, some animals, it might be a problem if they need the shade or the cover, or they need the wet ground. There might be some damage to those habitats that would be less favorable for those particular animals. But, certainly we're opening up the landscape in a way that might be favorable for some animals and create some great opportunities for hunting.
So certainly not all fire is bad. Our landscape evolved to require it. It's just that it didn't evolve to handle this large number of consistently bigger fires. And so what that is going to look like is the wild card.
I also spoke with our hunting and conservation editor, Andrew McKean, who's been tracking the drought's impact on waterfowl production in the Dakotas. North Dakota's brood survey results were released in June, and they weren't good. Pond counts were down 80% from last year, and they're 67% below the long-term average. Duck numbers are down 27% overall, and mallards are down roughly 50% from last year, their lowest in North Dakota since 1993. So, Andrew, can you tell us what's going on in the Dakotas? Why are the brood survey results so low?
Yeah, the Dakotas in general, but especially North Dakota, is in the midst of what they call profound drought. So, the kind of continuum goes from it's pretty bad, it's kind of dry, okay, we might get over it, and then there's extreme drought, which we're hurting, and then there's this profound drought, which means it's going to take a while to get out of it. So what that's meant, especially in this area of what they call the duck factory, is, this is glaciated plains that's got these little shallow prairie potholes all over it, these little wetland depressions. And in rainy years, and really in most years, it's pretty rainy in May and June, the very time the ducks are nesting. That's what's made it so productive, is all those little shallow wetlands are full. They're, as I mentioned, shallow, so it's easy for dabbling ducks to feed, and then they're surrounded by grasslands. There's abundant nesting habitat. I mean, you couldn't build better duck habitat when there's water. When there's no water, there's just nowhere for a duck to nest. And it's no exaggeration, but most, if not all, of those shallow wetlands are bone dry. There's not even mud in them. It's just cracked dirt in the bottom. And so what that's meant is, for a huge swath of this traditional area, especially for mallards and pintails and blue-winged teal, they're either having to overfly and nest up in the boreal forest of Canada or the Arctic tundra, or they've tried to pull off nesting in these kind of secondary and third-tier habitats, and they're probably not going to have effective nesting. So what Ducks Unlimited has said, and what North Dakota Game and Fish with their brood surveys is seeing, is very small family groups and consequently much older ducks in the population. So last year's adults are this year's adults. They've seen it all in terms of decoys and hunting situations, and so they're just a lot harder to hunt, but there's a lot fewer of them too. One of the interesting things from this dynamic is kind of a perfect storm. Last year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists couldn't fly in Canada because of COVID restrictions. They couldn't get into the country. So there were no spring survey flights last year in the main breeding grounds of the Canadian prairie potholes. So we went into this year's regulation structure and season setting season kind of blind. And what a lot of the waterfowl managers and flyway managers said was, man, we've had 15 years of really great populations and abundant ducks. Let's continue that liberal harvest structure this year, even though we don't have the data to support it. So those season structures went to print long before this drought really hit. It turns out we didn't have the duck production that we've had for the past 15 years, but yet we still have really liberal hunting seasons, bag limits, and season length. So it's going to put waterfowlers in a really interesting perspective of, we've got a long season and liberal bags, but we're not going to have a lot of ducks. I'm certainly looking at my own habits as a duck hunter. I might go out a few fewer times, or I might take a few fewer ducks when I do go out. But again, we're probably going to see pockets of abundance and then huge swaths of the flyways that are just going to be pretty disappointing this fall.
So here's a question that I'm sure doesn't have a simple answer. Duck seasons haven't started yet. Why can't we just change bag limits now that we have this information?
It's a good question, but the pace of change and the agencies moves really slow, and so these are not just state specific or even flyaway specific. These are international agreements that involve Canada and the U.S., and each is allowed to comment and have a public process around their allowed take. And just because of the scale of it and of so many moving parts, these things are established early, and then they don't really change. So yes, there could be an emergency closure or something that could be done on an ad hoc basis right now, but it would take a lot of work to get it done. And as I said, there may be pockets of hope and bright spots. The Great Lakes population in the Mississippi Flyway looks like it did pretty well. There are places in the Pacific Flyway where we've got a lot of boreal forest nesting that seems like it's done pretty well. So it's also really hard to kind of fine tune these once the mechanism and the regulatory structure is underway. But I would say, I think you can probably expect an echo effect next year. I think what will happen is when these flyway coordinators and biologists get back together and they say, whoops, we missed it in 2021, let's really be conservative in 2022. So I would expect to see a little bit of that, reduced bag limits, maybe shortened seasons next year, kind of as a way to compensate.
Okay, so it sounds like we're going to have a tough season regardless of the bag limit, because there will be fewer ducks, and the ones hunters do encounter will be more experienced, more seasoned adults. It's almost like it'll be up to duck hunters themselves mostly to manage things throughout the season, kind of like you mentioned.
Yeah, I think so. And I would also say it's easy to be sort of gloom and doom, and man, I'm seeing it in my county right now, as I've never seen it as dry. So we're also having some of that debilitating drought that the Dakotas are. In fact, much of my country is as dry as it's ever been recorded. But when it comes to the prairie potholes, one of the dynamics of wetlands is they need to periodically dry down like this so that when they're filled up with water again, they're even more productive. So I think the smart money says that when water does return to the prairies, and it will sometime, we're going to see this great big spike in duck production again. So, it's kind of this boom and bust cycle. We have been used for a whole human generation now of having kind of consistent duck numbers and pretty consistent hunting seasons. I don't think it's bad for nature to remind us that she's in control here, and we may have a down year this year, but if conditions are good again, we're going to have some pretty good years in the future.
How much do ducks follow that boom and bust cycle in nature? Like, is this decrease in production from drought just a dip for a year or two, or are we in it for the long haul here?
So ducks are so responsive to climatic conditions rather than like these shorter trends that you might see with forest health and sort of things like that. So one of the things I would say is this. Look at the liberal bag limits and high duck production. And I think it's been 15 to 18 years. We've had really consistently sort of year over year better fall flights because of good brood production. So that's been based on, good weather and rains at the right time, but it's also been based on habitat conservation. And so, the duck stamp that you buy or the waterfowl management area that is purchased with duck stamp money or migratory waterfowl money really does make a difference. It makes a difference in good years because there's water on the landscape, but it makes a big difference in bad years as well because there's still this habitat that's going to recharge when the water comes back. And one of the things that I think conservationists are looking at and saying, water will return. We will have those good years again as long as the habitat's there. And there's a worry that in dry years like this, especially if we have successively dry years, farmers might say, man, look at that low spot in that field. It hasn't had water in it for a few years. I'm going to plow it. I'm going to farm that. And then we're going to lose that wetland complex, for the next 20 or 30 years, for some long time. So as long as we can kind of take the long view and say, let's keep the habitat intact. When the water returns, we're going to have good years. I think that's the right approach.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited and produced by me, Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs. Reporting for this episode was by contributor Christine Peterson and our hunting editor Andrew McKean. The wildfire and mallard sounds were recorded by Jennifer Jarrett and Jay Job of the National Park Service. News broadcasts were excerpted from ABC News, ABC4 Utah, NASA, NBC Bay Area, Newswatch 12, Vice News, and the Wall Street Journal. Music in this episode was composed and performed by Gary Kramer and Federico Coderoni and Company via APM Music.